I am Frank Gavin, the director of the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas. Everyone, if we could focus on the panel now. I am very pleased to be part of this terrific conference, Crisis in the Eurozone, that the European Union Center of Excellence is putting together. And before starting, I just want to say what an extraordinary job Jamie, Doug, and Sally Dixon have done. If we could offer them a round of applause for just putting this together. And all the people that have helped them. So much in life is about timing. And I think, like a lot of us, I've gone to many, many conferences and been on many, many panels. I don't think I've ever been on one that is better timed in my life. So we're very, very fortunate not to be just to be discussing some very serious issues, so it's not fortunate from that perspective. But the panel today is why the crisis in the Eurozone. I'm not going to go into great details about our panelists. They're extraordinarily well qualified to discuss these issues. You can see their biographies in the program, but it'd be hard to think of four people better qualified to discuss this important issue. We are under very serious time constraints. We need to get out of here by 12 for our lunch, and we have 4 speakers, so I'm going to ask each of the speakers to go no more than 15 minutes, and if they go a little less, that would even be better before opening it up to questions. And we are going to go in the order that it appears in the program, and we're going to start with Heiner Flossbeck, who is the Director of the Division of Globalization and Development Strategies at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development.
Thank you very much. I'm doing from here because I have a very small PowerPoint and some slides to present. Otherwise, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. It's a great pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, I had to fly for 15 hours, and I've given 15 minutes to speak, so I have to be very efficient in my speech, but that is your problem, not my problem. So I'm going to go straight into the core of the matter and touch some of the things that have been mentioned this morning by passing, but not going into it so much. The question that we have been asked is why these problems in the Eurozone, and I think there we have to go a bit deeper into economics. Why this problem in the Eurozone? And let me first say what many people do not understand, why we do have a currency union in the Eurozone or in Europe. This is one of the core questions that we have to answer before we come to why we have a problem in that Eurozone, in that monetary union in the Eurozone. We have to answer the question, was there a rationale for going into a currency union? And I think, yes, it is. Some people say it was purely for political reasons, and so there was no economic rationale. I think that's wrong. What happened before we went into the Eurozone, so into the monetary union, was that we had a strange arrangement in monetary affairs in Europe, which was an arrangement where many countries absolutely fixed their exchange rate to Germany, to the D-Mark. The D-Mark was clearly the anchor of that system. So they fixed their exchange rate. Austria, for example, Kunibert fixed its exchange rate forever. It had never changed its exchange rate after the Bretton Woods system collapsed. So immediately, the Austrian shilling was pegged to the D-Mark and never changed. And many other countries followed for the very simple reason that they didn't want to have, let me say, be blunt, and my French colleague will not fully agree, but let me say it like that. They didn't want to have high inflation anymore. They wanted to be as successful as Germany, not only in terms of inflation, but also in terms of inflation. Inflation was, so to say, the medium, the means by which they thought they could get as successful as Germany. And in this arrangement, only one thing is really a bad institutional, is a bad setting, so to say. Namely that you have, in such an arrangement that could go on forever, you have all the advantages of trade, you have to exchange money, but well, what's the matter if I go to Austria and change my D-marks into shillings and back to at a fixed rate? It's nothing. So that is not important. Important is in such an arrangement that you have monetary policy that is monetary policy of the anchor country and nothing else. It is monetary policy of the anchor country. And you want to go a step further. You want to go a step further, so not stay with the Argentinian arrangement where you have fixed your exchange rate unilaterally to the dollar. Then your monetary policy is American UN monetary policy, but you have no influence on that policy. If you want to go a step further, then you have to go into something like a monetary union, because this gives you only the seat in Frankfurt. Who mentioned the seat in Frankfurt? At least you have a seat. Whether it's used or not is a different question, but you have a seat. And this was a big achievement. It was a big achievement to jump from an purely anchored system vis-à-vis the D-Mark into the Eurozone, because that gave Austria and the other countries a seat and a voice in the system. And that's an achievement. And there's no way back, no simple way back to say, do it with flexible exchange rate and such things. I don't want to say nonsense, but it is nonsense in my view. If you look around the world, you see how badly flexible exchange rate work and how much distortion they create. And we have, just in the G20 this year, we had a long debate about that. I don't want to go into that. So, but what happened? Why did it go so wrong? A monetary union is a union of countries that want to have the same inflation rate. But not only for one moment of time, but forever. That's the critical thing. They want the same inflation rate, not only for the year 1997, when there was the criterion that you should reach, so to say, the German inflation rate of 2%, but forever. And this is the critical thing. And there we look briefly into the matter, and we see, oh, this is funny. My PowerPoint does not work here. I tried it before. There should be curves here. This is too funny. It's not working. Maybe someone can help me. I don't know. Is someone able to put it on a computer? Because otherwise I lose all my time. And explain, because I think we have to put it in one more time. Maybe then it will be working from the stick and get it from the stick. So what happened is very simple. Namely, all the countries, no, you have to change it. You have to get out of this and take the other one. Oh, here we are. Yeah, but this way, but not in the presentation. But let me see. Maybe it works now. No, you see, it's not there. So let's keep it like that. Can you see it?
Of course.
You can see it. That's very good. So what we have is, unfortunately, I wanted to show it a bit more sophisticated, but no, it doesn't work. So it's okay. What we have is we have different inflation performances in this currency union. We have Southern Europe, and by the way, it's not a Greek problem. The problem in Europe has nothing to do, well, nothing is an exaggeration, but close to nothing with Greece. Greece is just one country, one of the countries in this blue line. And this blue line are the countries in Southern Europe, including Italy, and you see the name Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. These countries had an inflation performance in the last 10 years, it's all from 99, from the beginning of the currency union, of something like 2.6%. That's not bad, huh? If you have 2.6%, that's not an accelerating inflation or a big problem. You see, one country got it absolutely right if you take the target of, that we had in this monetary union. The target was exactly 2%. It was the German target. The old German target was a target for everyone in Europe, and there was one country that got it right, namely France. France was very much criticized, but France was the only country that got it right. They were exactly on the target. And the whole of the European Monetary Union was also on the target. You see, the EMU as a whole was absolutely on the target. But one country got it absolutely wrong. More wrong than anyone else. One country got it more wrong than anyone else. And that country was not Greece, it was Germany. That country is Germany. They got it more wrong. The deviation of Germany from the inflation target, if you look at the end in 2010, is bigger than the Greece deviation from the target. So what did we have? We had an arrangement, we had an institutional arrangement that said you should reach an inflation target of 2%. And the country that most violated this arrangement, it was a common arrangement, everybody agreed about 2%, not below 2%, but 2% for many reasons that I do not want to go into. all the country agreed to the 2%, but Germany deviated more than anyone else. And if you deviate downwards, it's as bad as if you deviate upwards, because there is no rule to say the one is worse than the other. The only arguments that we have is that deflation is worse than inflation, so it's even worse. So, and behind this, maybe I can show this in, no, sorry, again. Behind this was the inflation target. I don't want to explain this further, but it could be shown very clearly. Behind this were deviations in what is called unit labor cost. And unit labor cost is the deviation of your nominal wages to your productivity, to the national productivity. So what is asked for that you have nominal wages that rise in line with productivity plus 2% in all countries. That's a very simple rule. And when I was deputy finance minister in Germany, which I was for a short time, I tried to impose that rule on all European countries. And we even created an institution which was called macroeconomic dialogue to do exactly that, namely to give countries guidance in imposing such a rule. Again, the only country that got it right was France. In France, wages were rising. At least they were rising. Maybe the statistics are all wrong, but as far as we believe in statistics, France got it right. And the real wages were rising with productivity. That's the rule. Your real wages should rise with your own productivity, not with the productivity of Germany or something like that. That's nonsense. With your own productivity. So you have to live according to your means. Not above your means, but not below your means. You should live according to your means. That is, in the core of the matter, what a currency union asks. And that's not very much. Huh? That's not such a big thing. To get that every country adjusts, given the inflation target, to its own means. That you have to do anyway. In the end, you have nothing else but your means. You have your productivity and nothing else. So the United States have to adjust to their means. The only question is how they distribute their means. That's a different question I come to a bit later. So what happened and why was this now? Why did this happen? Was it, so to say, an idea by Germany to say, now we have the currency union, now we can exploit, so to say, our it was not German traditional policies, but new belt-tightening policies to gain market shares in Europe? Well, some people may have thought like that. I think in the German industry community, there were surely some people who were in favor of the monetary union because they thought this is right. But for most of the people, including most of the people in the government, this was not the crucial point. The crucial point was quite different and totally independent of the euro. And so far, this is the tragic and the tragedy of the situation, that Greece is now collateral damage of the euro, but the euro itself is collateral damage of something bigger, of a much bigger fight that took place in Germany and it's taking place every day elsewhere. What is that bigger fight? Well, the bigger fight was that at the same time, or a bit in before the euro was installed officially, the German government, including the Social Democrats and including the German unions, which were at that time still quite strong, decided to go for a unique historical experiment. And that experiment was called, we cut the wages. We do not raise real wages in line with productivity anymore, as we have done 40 years before, to bring down our unemployment rate. This coincided with the euro. I can tell you I was in the first red-green, social democratic green government, and although I was fired rather soon when my minister, Oscar Lafontaine, left, but even at that time, nobody in the German government thought about killing the euro or something like that. Nobody thought about killing the euro. But they all thought to bring down German unemployment, because Germany was really in the worst situation of all countries. It had the lowest growth rate, it had the highest unemployment, unemployment was rising, and so they took a desperate measure to bring down the unemployment. Unfortunately, the whole experiment failed, well, it did not fully fail, but it failed to a certain extent, and this is extremely important to understand. It's extremely important to understand for economists in particular what happened there. what happened was that two mechanisms came into play. The first mechanism was that due to German wage cutting with given productivity went on rather unchanged. With given productivity, Germany started into a beggar thy neighbor experiment. And this is what you see here. All products that were at 100 euros in 1999 have now a cost or a price of 107 in Germany, and 133 in Southern Europe, and 117 in France, or 20 in France. Oh, a bit more than 20. By the way, that's why France has positioned itself on the wrong side. That is the main mistake of Mr. Sarkozy. He has never understood where he should have sided. He should have sided the Southern Europeans because he is as much in trouble as the Southern Europeans. Because if the French products all cost 125 and the German cost 105, forget about France. It will be wiped out as the others. It takes only a bit longer if we do not change fundamentally this system. If this system is not changed, you can be absolutely sure, I do not want to go into showing you the figures of the trade flows, it can be shown crystal clear that this system sooner or later wipes out the export industry of all the countries that are north of Germany. All the countries that are north of Germany. And so far, this is absolutely unsustainable. But again, coming back to what was the second channel? So the first channel that Germany relied on, namely the channel through export, was absolutely successful. And this everybody could have told. I mean, every good, let me say, Keynesian or Kaleckian or such kind of economist could have told you that this is one channel that would happen. If you have one big country that tightens its belt dramatically, forces wages to remain below productivity, and there is no reaction on the currency side, there is no appreciation of the currency of that country, would be a winner in the competition of nations and would gain huge current account surpluses. There's no doubt about it. But the other channel, and this is the critical thing, unfortunately I do not have the, I only have the trade imbalances. I do not have the other chart here. The other channel, namely the channel that was mainly thought to be the important channel for the good, willing part of the German people who thought we are going for this unique experiment of wage cutting, the other channel did not work out at all. And that was the neoclassical nexus that you cut real wages, and through the cutting of real wages, you change the production structure, you reduce productivity, and through the reduction of productivity, you employ more people, you work more labor intensive than before. This did not work out at all. And it can be shown that it didn't work out at all, because what happened at the same time when German exports exploded, German domestic demand was absolutely flat. It remained absolutely flat over the last 15 years. So the exchange of wages against the trade-off of wages against domestic demand never happened. It was just a beggar thy neighbor strategy and nothing else. And this is the crucial thing to understand, because here we come to the question how this can be settled. I do not want to go into that. My time is over in a minute. But the point is, if you go for such a strategy and you do not have the neighbors that are, so to say, accepting your economic imperialism for a time at least, till they are bankrupt, and that is where we are now, till they are close to bankruptcy, then you have no chance to go for such a strategy. And that is the important thing behind this. Because what we have, the big battle that we have in this world, is not between Germany and the other Europeans. It's not between South and North, China and Germany or so. The big battle is still, believe it or not, the battle between labor and capital. This is still the big battle. I know it's fashionable in the United States to a priori dismiss arguments by calling them class warfare argument. The Republicans like that very much, to say, this is class warfare. I tell you what happens in this world is class warfare. Because what we have, look at the United States, my last sentence. What happens in the United States right now? For the first time, if you look at your statistics carefully, for the first time in history, in the modern history since the Second World War, we are 2 years in a recovery, and in the United States, the wages, the nominal wages are rising by absolutely zero. They're not rising at all. We have, for the first time, not only a jobless recovery, that's a normal thing, for the first time we have in the United States a wageless recovery. Wageless recovery. And that is exactly what Germany did 15 years ago, wageless recovery. And I can tell you how this experiment will going to end. Because in the United States, there is no market that they can occupy. There are no markets, no partners that they can exploit. There is no currency union that they can use. The experiment will end in disaster. It will end in disaster because if you do not have a regime that allows the systematic participation of workers in the productivity increase, and this happens for the first time in the United States that it's not at all there. This is what the people are talking about when they talk about 99%. But it's worse than ever. It was worse already 10 years ago, but now it is worse than ever. And if you have such a regime, capitalism hits a wall. It hits dramatically a wall because no economy can grow successfully if the people only have to rely on bubbles that sooner or later burst to consume, and if they do not can expect that they will participate in the success of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next we'll have Robert Gutman, who is a professor of economics at Hofstra University and the University of Paris.
Yes, thanks first of all for the organizers of this conference for having invited me. Again, there's no more topical moment than this one. But I want to give you a broader context, and trying to do this in 15 minutes will be extremely difficult because you don't want to talk too fast, and yet you have to. So forgive me if I fly through this, but this is on my mind, and I just want to share that with you. First of all, I do think that we are in the middle of a structural crisis. I ask myself, why are certain crises deeper and longer than others? Others being the normal business cycle downturns that we're used to recurrently every 7 to 10 years. We occasionally, actually with a recurrent rhythm, have bigger crises than that. And my own work lately has been to basically figure them out as structural crises and as part of a long wave phenomenon. There's a long tradition here. I don't want to go too far into it. But there's one pattern that I see with all those crises, and I'm studying 4 crises right now, including this one that started in 2007, which is that they come about in a 1-2 punch. There's a second shoe dropping. And the Euro crisis is the second shoe dropping in this particular crisis. Right? And this happens typically in the process when you look at it historically, like when somebody in the 4th or 5th inning and somebody hits a home run, a grand slam, it changes the nature of the game. Not positive, but negative for the losing team here. I'm trying to not go too far with this metaphor, even though with the Texas Rangers I can probably make that metaphor work here quite well. The point is that you have to understand that when we're looking at the big crises that we've had in the history of capitalism, 1873-79, 1929, 1939, 1969 to 82, which is a stagflation crisis, the others were deflationary crisis, and now the current one, 2007, that there is this crucial moment of the second punch, when the second shoe drops. And one of the things that I'm trying to understand is how that happens, why that happens. And it seems to me quite clear that it happens within the international monetary arrangements, within the international monetary system, that you have at the beginning a systemic crisis that hits somewhere in the system. In this case, it was a subprime crisis leading to the Lehman bankruptcy. And then certain things go haywire. But the most important aspect of the haywire is that you have a buildup of a contradiction that's fundamental, which is a contradiction between financial centralization and, hold on, why can I not do this?
Try the other mouse. On the keyboard. Hit the keyboard.
Enter?
Yeah.
hold on.
More space, even space is a good.
Yes, okay. Yes, the key lesson, the 1-2 punch, right? If we go to the last paragraph here, there's a what we call a Minsky moment in financial crisis theory. After Hyman Minsky, it creates an asymmetric shock in the system, and then there you have the tension between financial centralization and monetary fragmentation, right? It's an important process, very, very understudied, I would think, but financial centralization is a process that ironically actually intensifies during a crisis. It's basically the growth of finance by various means, financial innovations, encouraging leveraging, deregulation, we have already made reference to it several times. It's a process that starts typically before these great crises in its own ways, and it intensifies because of the crisis. That's what's ironic. A crisis with a liquidity trap, and a crisis with accounting gimmicks, and a crisis with all kinds of mechanisms of also financial institutions buying cheaper financial institutions that have been developed. All of that is intensifying financial centralization at the same time as that asymmetric shock gets into a fragmentation of the system where several different monetary standards emerge, competing or they disintegrate, right? So there's a particular process in place, and that process, when it reaches a certain critical mass of intensity, then creates another crisis. A second shoe drops, okay? And when you look at the patterns, you see that fairly well established in the history of our system, capitalist system. Now, my argument is that we are in the middle of this crisis, and the Eurozone crisis is the second shoe, after which the whole ballgame changes. The second shoe has not yet dropped, but it is about to drop. And what's important about the shoe is that it becomes a disorderly process. It becomes a chaotic process, like the Lehman bankruptcy. It really breaks down the financial system. It becomes a systemic crisis of the financial system. That's what then sets off debt deflation processes and a depression. In order to understand how the Eurozone could become the second shoe, we have to look at it from the very beginning. And Heiner and several others have already made reference to that. The system was set up already from the very beginning with certain institutional flaws that basically were necessitated by political compromises, because nobody in Europe wanted to have a federalist system like the United States. So you have, first of all, you have two different groups of countries. We have already seen this many times here. You have the core countries, the periphery countries. They're fundamentally different, and it's beyond just saying surplus countries and deficit countries, but they're very, very different. And they're put under one single currency roof without any mechanisms of real convergence. Real convergence means basically the catching up, allowing for a catching up process of periphery countries. A catching up process that is based on their industrial production apparatus, not just on excess consumption. In this system, you have only one nominal convergence anchor. You don't have real convergence processes, but you have a nominal convergence anchor, and that's the Stability Growth Pact of 1997, which limits budget deficits to about 3% of GDP, and also provides a limit to the public debt GDP ratio of about 60%. If you're way above 60%, like Belgium, Italy, and so forth, were from the very beginning, then at least work it down gradually towards that 60% goal. But that anchor was immediately ignored. And that's important, because it will come back to haunt the whole process. And then you have in place inadequate adjustment mechanisms. You take away the most important two go-to mechanisms of adjustment, which is interest rate changes and exchange rate changes, by setting up a single currency. You then have the second layer of adjustment process, both of them inadequate, entirely inadequate. You don't have a European Union budget. The EU budget itself is 1.5% of EU's GDP, so it's a tiny one. And you also have labor mobility lacking in Europe. Here in the US, you have always had a mechanism not only of fiscal transfers, but also of labor mobility. If I can't get a job in New York, I can come to Austin and work here. There, it's not so easy to do. There's a lot of barriers, even with nominal laws that allow me to, for example, I'm Austrian citizen, I work in Paris and live there, but that's not so easy to do, I can tell you that, even for somebody who's highly qualified like me. So what is then left is a creeping adjustment mechanism of labor market deflation, made much more intense by the Germans starting that process, right, as Heine well put. It has to do with wage cuts, it has to do with mass unemployment of a long-term nature, it has to do with ultimately the flexibilization of the labor market. And in that sense, I'm totally agreeing that this battle is ultimately between capital and labor on a very massive level. On top of that, as a fourth institutional flaw, you have a conscious choice not to have crisis management on a federal level, because that would be smelling too much towards fiscal federalism. That's where you have the impotence of the European policy apparatus that will come to haunt them, of course, right? You have a tiny EU budget, doesn't allow any fiscal transfers, doesn't allow any deficit spending, and you have a constrained European Central Bank that is shaped with a deeper monetarist bias than you can imagine. Nobody is more monetarist than the ECB. So you have an initial boom period for two reasons, ultimately. First of all, Germany gets distracted by its own unification experiment. It's something that we really need to talk about because it shapes the whole recent history of Europe. Germans collect one other trauma, which is their own reunification, which went very badly for a long time, and they're totally distracted. But importantly, macroeconomically, the Germans relax their own standards. They have more inflation, more budget deficits, more transfers, and less of a current account surplus for that period. So it relaxes the other countries' constraints. And on top of that, the SGP, the Stability and Growth Pact, gets ignored, neither here nor enforced, and so you have a debt-financed acceleration of growth. Now comes something crucial, which has to be understood. You have all great financial crises follow a process of mispricing risk, and then the mistake being realized in a great crisis, and then the opposite extreme. An incredible overpricing of risk. But here in Europe, you have two different mispricings going on between, let's say, 1999 and 2007. You have, on the one hand, you have a process where the yield spreads on the bonds, the sovereign bonds in particular, but in general terms, in long-term interest rates between the different countries get compressed tremendously. Greek bonds are practically in the same interest yields than German bonds, as if everybody was trading German bunds, okay? This I would call umbrella pricing, because it really prices according to the weakest, okay? Which are the outlying periphery countries, as if they were strong enough. It wants to protect the weakest, right? So this kind of low interest rate structure, especially when you have relatively high short-term interest rates due to the monetarist bias of the European Central Bank with a flat yield curve, that's your classic bubble scenario, and you get all kinds of bubbles, including public sector bubbles, and I mean very easy payment flows from programs for a while in all kinds of countries. You have housing bubbles, you have investment banking bubbles, where even small banks want to become large investment banks, okay, madly. And all of this, of course, is part of the financial centralization process, creating new markets, creating new instruments, layering financial transactions, and so forth, right? All of this basically is designed to move everybody to higher levels of leverage. And so the Europeans get into consumer debt and all kinds of things that they didn't go there before. On the other hand, you have another mispricing, which is the euro itself. The euro is not the average exchange rate within the structure of the Eurozone. It gets priced increasingly as if every country was Germany. So the euro gets substantially overvalued. And that's an expression of the monetary fragmentation, because you have basically the disintegration of the dollar standard. And so you're looking for new monetary zones to emerge. Now, yesterday was the euro, today it's going to be the renminbi, tomorrow it may be the resource currencies, who knows? So you have a process of monetary fragmentation where the global financial community makes bets on the euro as a runner-up competitor to the dollar. And this I would call anchor pricing, as if all the countries were Germany. Germany is the anchor, but now everybody's the anchor in a global international monetary system. But the problem with that is that it creates incredible biases within a number of economies within the Eurozone, because with cheap imports and easily available cheap debt, they can go on consumption binges, but they don't have they don't have the means to follow up with the production apparatus, the modernization of their production apparatus, because they're getting strangulated by the high overvalued euro. So you have unsustainable growth dynamics. Fast growth. I mean, Spain grows 4, 5, 6%. Portugal grows far beyond its natural growth rate of 1.5%. It gets 3, 4%, etc. So you can see the unsustainability gradually emerging when you're looking at these three relationships. Okay, I don't want to get too far into that, but it's fascinating to watch because you can basically see the crisis gradually building. And then on top of that, of course, that's what you need. You need to get asymmetric shocks. That's what blows up the whole system. And you get a sequence of asymmetric shocks. The first one actually starts quietly in 2005. Two things happen. On the one hand, the Germans start their reform, intensifying the reform program that they started already with the red-green. They have the Hartz reforms and a bunch of other reforms to regain competitiveness. They basically freeze wages and flexibilize the labor market. At the same time, you also have a reform of the Stability Growth Pact, weakening it basically, and thereby making it easier for countries to intensify their binge behavior. Oops, no, I don't want to go there. I want to get back. Yes. The actual asymmetric shock that shakes the system, that starts this great crisis, is in September 2008, when the collapse of Lehman bursts the EU bubbles and exposes the underlying divergences within the European Union. Suddenly those countries are clearly different. The macroeconomic data from then on widens, and we have seen several indicators of that already presented in this conference, both in the first panel with Matthias and then also with Heiner. But the next asymmetric shock, and I don't think we should underestimate this, is that when you look at the global international monetary system, you have this fragmentation happening after the Lehman process, and the fragmentation translates into distinctly different quote-unquote recovery patterns. We're not talking about a recovery, really, because almost no country has actually reached its pre-2008 level in macroeconomic indicators. The US is just getting there, hopefully next quarter. So these are incredibly slow recoveries by anybody's standards. But you have a V pattern of growth in the emerging market economies. You have a saucer-like flat U pattern in the US, but you have a reverse L pattern in the European Union. Okay, the European Union sinks 5, 10% and then stays flat. And that creates the tension, the underlying tension for this crisis. Okay, the divergencies, not only within the European Union, but the European Union vis-a-vis the other blocs. And therefore, the crisis is ultimately inevitable, and it starts, of course, when the weakest link breaks, which is Greece. Now, however, you're facing a hard period because you have a systemic crisis. Okay, and I would think it's a systemic crisis that you have to understand on 3 dimensions. So I call it a triple systemic crisis, or triply. I don't know whether that's an English word, but you now have an adjustment mechanism that's a crisis-driven. I mean, crisis is always an adjustment mechanism. When all the other adjustment mechanisms fail, then crisis becomes the one that rebalances the economy if crisis is supposed to do the job of cleaning out underlying imbalances. The problem with the structural crisis is that you never know whether it's going to happen or not. Recessions, business cycle upturns do that. But great crises last until that imbalancing is done, rebalancing is done, or until reforms take place to take it out of its misery. So you have a new adjustment mechanism which has to do with the yield spreads. The EU bond yield spreads. And on top of that, you also have this reinforced with credit default swaps. And on top of the credit default swaps, you have a third layer, which is synthetic finance. It's precisely, that's why everybody's terrified of the unorderly default of Greek, because if there's an unorderly default of Greek, then you have an explosion, a kind of a nuclear explosion in those layers. Nobody knows where the connections are. That was also the surprise with the Lehman bankruptcy, that we couldn't understand those layers. They're in the shadow banking system. They're far beyond the sight of national regulators. And so we know for sure what we don't know. That a disorderly default of any of the countries on the periphery of the European Union is catastrophic. But before getting there, and that's the problem, the financial markets making those bets, three-layered bets, drive politicians crazy. The politicians are increasingly torn between the panic-like impatience of financial markets and their collective polarization of pessimism, and, on the other hand, a public that faces 20 years of austerity, a wasted generation. So there's an incredible tension politically there. Then you have a financial crisis of major proportion, because if you have a sovereign debt crisis, you not only put into question the entire underlying social contract of each country and you're demolishing it, but you also have a banking crisis, because government debt before the crisis was considered like cash. And now it's suddenly not like cash at all. It's the opposite of cash. That's the problem, right? And thirdly, and this should not be forgotten, okay? We are in the midst of a transformation of the international monetary system away from the dollar standard. And it's a question of how well we can coordinate ourselves out of this, right? Especially the relationship between debtor countries and creditor countries, right? This is completely wrongly presented in our own economic theoretical thinking. And with the divergent growth patterns, we really run the risk of getting into a very mercantilist, badly functioning, uncoordinated, triadic system of monetary blocks that ultimately would be worse even than the globalization that we so much decry. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Jan Toporowski. He's the professor of economics and finance and chair of the economics department at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London.
All right. Thank you very much. You may wonder why the chair of the economics department at the School of Oriental and African Studies is talking about Europe. Well, we do actually do research on Europe, and we have a major research project coming up on Europe. Can I first of all thank Jamie Galbraith, I mean, for organizing this very, very timely discussion, as everyone has mentioned. I mean, there is the usual in Europe. The politics of Europe are, have recurrent conspiracy theories, and one of the recurrent conspiracy theories is that everything that happens in Europe is the result of some American intrigue. And Jamie has already mentioned his part in orchestrating the fall of the Greek government to add drama to our deliberations. So I look forward to Jamie orchestrating a happier solution along the lines of our discussions to the European crisis. Let me let's say something else also about the sort of the politics of unification. I come from a very peculiar Polish community that ended up washed up in Europe washed up in England in 1945, and amongst other emigres of Eastern Europe. My wife calls me the white Pole. In fact, in those emigre communities, there was there were various discussions about creating some kind of East European federation, because all the communities knew that the reason for one of the reasons for the war, for the Second World War, was that they hadn't managed to come together, and all of them actually had a fairly clear view of what that federation would look like. So for the Poles, it was going to be a federation which would include all the countries of Eastern Europe, excluding the Russians and the Germans, because they were the people who'd started the Second World War and couldn't be trusted, so you excluded them. The Romanians had a fairly similar view, except that they saw it as the federation consisting of the whole of Eastern Europe, excluding the Germans and the Russians because they'd started the war, also the Poles because they couldn't be trusted. And this had the happy, for the Poles, their version had the happy characteristic property that it left Poland as the biggest country in the federation. For the Romanians, it left the Romanians as the biggest country. The Czechoslovaks had a similar idea, excluding the Poles, the Germans, the Russians, the Poles and the Romanians, because then it left the Czechoslovaks as the largest country. And so it went on right down to the Albanians and the Bulgarians, who could get together because they had no common border. I think this, to some extent, Europe, the European project was an attempt to overcome these kinds of rivalries, and in particular with the realization very early on that to make political unification successful, you had to have common European, common economic institutions. Here I want to reinforce something that Heine Flassbeck mentioned, and that is why we have the euro. There's a very specific reason why we have the euro, and that is that the previous system broke down. The fixed but adjustable exchange rate system that existed just collapsed. It collapsed, probably most people here in this room will remember, in 1992, and is simply not viable in a Europe without capital controls. And you cannot have, I mean, as it also showed, you cannot make capital controls effective within Europe. So effectively, the euro is here to stay. The only question is how it can be made to work. Again, we go back to the problems, the way the Europe was set, the way the euro was set up. It bears all the hallmarks of the circumstances under which it was set up. It was set up because, as I said, the fixed but adjustable exchange rate systems cannot work in Europe. They cannot work in situations where you cannot enforce capital controls. It was set up, it was, as people have already mentioned, the imposition onto the European, onto the whole area of the Eurozone of a particular German monetary doctrine, the doctrine that the central bank should not finance, the central bank should not engage in the primary market for government bonds, banned under Article 123 of the treaty, of the Maastricht Treaty. So, and this coincided with the post-unification inflation in Germany, apparently brought down by the strict policy of the Bundesbank. But as we now know, what it really was the entry of China into the global economy, the cheap imports, which brought cheap imports plus the decline of commodity prices, which brought down inflation rates. This was a very neat coincidence for European, for central bankers who had adopted the new consensus in monetary policy, the notion that central banks can control the rate of inflation. It all seemed to work for them. For 15 years, over 10 years, up until 2008, they could believe that their policies were controlling the rate of inflation. So as a result of this, we have in the Eurozone something which I call a set of institutions which are fundamentally dysfunctional. You have a central bank without a government. You have governments without proper central banking facilities. And let's remember that the origins of central banking in Europe are very different to the origins of central banking here in the United States. Here in the United States, the Federal Reserve was set up to provide reserves for commercial banks. In Europe, the central banks, the origin of central banks in the 18th, 19th century was to finance government debt, or was to manage a government debt, not necessarily to finance it, but certainly to manage it. So you have governments without proper central banks, and finally banks without an effective lender of last resort. This is the fundamental issue which has been avoided in various discussions about the structure of European banking. They've spoken about European competition within European banks, a single European banking market, but have looked away from the issue of the lender of last resort. Why? Because if you have national central banks which are responsible as lenders of last resort to their national banks, if you have international banking, who is going to be their lender of last resort? This is the issue that's been avoided. And secondly, specifically, the lack of an institution to manage the market for government debt. Absolutely fundamentally necessary. This, this nowadays is left largely to coincidence. You have a system, for example, in for the US government, it's other central banks that manage the secondary market for US government debt. In Europe, there isn't such an institution. And the result is that you have the usual in this situation of institutional dysfunction, you have at one extreme, one response is to say, well, of course, all this would be okay if all the governments operated in accordance with the rules. I used to work in a dysfunctional institution where a young lecturer, it's just everything was wrong in the institution. And I remember one day as we were standing by, I was standing by a photocopier that didn't function, of course, because the whole system didn't function. And a young lecturer came along to me and was standing there also in the queue behind me, and she said, you know, everything that goes wrong here is because people will not follow the rules. A very common view in a certain type of functionary. The specific situation that we have now is very, very dangerous because Europe, the Eurozone, is now in a deflationary trap. Virtually all countries in the Eurozone have excessive debt to GDP ratios. Even Germany. Germany has a debt to GDP ratio, depending on how you calculate, between 82 and 85%. What does this? What do the rules say they should all do now? They should all now operate fiscal surpluses in order to generate the surpluses that can be used to repay the government debt. and bring it back down to the required level. Why I call this a deflationary trap is because fiscal surpluses will actually reduce GDP, and they will reduce GDP before you've actually generated the fiscal surplus. The increased taxation or the reduced government expenditure will reduce GDP before you've got to the stage of the government having the money in its bank account, the credit in its bank account, to be able to repay its debt. So in effect, there is no way forward under the present rules. Waiting in the wings are two very, very real risk factors. The most important one, the biggest one, is a possible slowdown in China. This is the one that's been responsible for maintaining high employment in the advanced manufacturing countries of Europe. The second one, which only was briefly mentioned a few months ago, and then, of course, pushed off the front pages by the Greek government, is the potential crisis next door, which is that of Cyprus, that has a banking sector balance sheet of Icelandic proportions, 9 times GDP. So there are very, very real potential risk factors, and it's those that are not being dealt with in the present crisis. So we cannot go forward by operating in accordance with the rules. We have to actually start having to do something about reforming the institutions and reflating the European economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our final speaker will be Gilles Ravaud, who's an assistant professor at the Institute of European Studies at the University of Paris.
Thank you. So many things have been said already this morning. I'll try not to repeat them. And one of them, which Matthias in particular, and I think Terry as well, mentioned, is this question of the several European projects. What was the initial European project? Has it been sort of cheated on? Was it a social democratic compromise which became a neoliberal agenda? I think this question is really open. But what we know for a fact is that some secret societies have been very efficient in promoting their ideas and changing the whole intellectual and political debate, such as, for instance, the Mont Pelerin Society with the Friedman and Hayek and the likes. And as it happens, there are other transatlantic connections, and a very positive one is the one between Jamie Galbraith and Aurore Laluc back in France. And I would like to thank them both for having invited me to this conference, and I seriously hope that they are as successful as the Mont Pelerin Society in changing the political and intellectual debate in Europe. So what I'm going to deal with are the so-called soft European policies. So we've dealt with hard matter for the moment, and now I'm going to discuss the policies which are being sort of organized by the EU. So they were called the Lisbon Strategy. The Lisbon Strategy was launched in year 2000, and its aim was to make the EU the most competitive knowledge-based economy in the world in 2010. So of course, if it was not so sad, it would be extremely funny. And the Lisbon Strategy has since been replaced by a strategy called EU 2020, which has set goals for the EU in year 2020. So I'll have four or 5 points about those strategies. The first one is that the theoretical model or the empirical model used in these strategies is wrong. What the EU explains in all these lengthy documents is very clear. It goes like this. Increase competition, right, through structural reforms. More competition should bring more innovation. Innovation means higher competitiveness, hence more jobs, high wages, in the end, more income for the social security systems. So at the very end, we even preserve the so-called European social model. Well, there are many things which are wrong in this simple model. First, that it takes the US as a textbook example of this, which we know is wrong because state intervention is crucial, has been crucial in the US in developing many innovations. Also, there are many works, empirical works by economists, showing that cooperation is at least as important in innovation processes as competition. The other thing which is funny about this strategy is that there are actually in Europe a few countries which match the goals of the strategy, namely the Nordic countries. Right? It's in the Nordic countries that you have the highest level of social cohesion, as promoted by the strategy. It's also in the Nordic countries that you have the highest level of public and private spending in research and development. So those countries are or should be the model for the rest of Europe to follow. But unfortunately, those countries also happen to rely on high taxes. And the European Union doesn't like high taxes. Why? We don't know, but that's the way it is. So Sweden is being repetitively criticized in European documents and is being asked to reduce its level of taxes, notwithstanding the fact that it's precisely this very high level of taxes which allows those countries to have developed education systems in particular, which make them so competitive. My second point is about the social situation in Europe. It is widely thought, and that's what I thought as well until recently, that the social situation is very different in the EU when you compare it to the US. Well, I would like to challenge this view. Of course, unemployment is very high in Europe, but poverty is very high in Europe as well. There are many measures of the poverty rate. If you there are basically two ways. If you calculate poverty as it's usually done, by comparing the income of the individual to the median income in his or her country, then the overall poverty rate in the EU is something like 16%. But if you take the EU as a whole, right, and you refer to the median income in the EU, and then you compare what people get to this level, then you reach a much higher poverty rate, which is something around 25%, right? So figures something like 28% in the EU as a whole, and more like 20% in the Eurozone. So poverty is actually really high in Europe, and something has to be done about it. So now my third point is, what is this EU 2020 strategy? So it has set 5 goals, so I'm going to mention them briefly. The first goal is to increase the employment rate, that is the part of the population who is working, which is currently around 68% in the EU, to bring it to 75%. The second goal is to increase spending in research and development. The third is to make the European economy greener. The fourth is to reduce school dropouts. And the fifth, which might be the most interesting one, is to diminish the number of poor in the EU by 20 million. Now the problem is there are no instruments, there are absolutely no serious instruments in this strategy whatsoever to achieve those goals, right? So as we say in French, these are only spoken words, right? Words which don't mean anything. But what's more troubling is the fact that if there's this commitment of the EU to reduce poverty, although if you read the text, you'll see it's a light commitment, there is also surprisingly a commitment to increase inequalities, right? For the EU, inequalities in Europe are not high enough. In particular, a core element of the European social model used to be the fact that you had centralized wage negotiation, which ensured that wages would more or less go up at the same rhythm, whether you would be in a sector with high productivity gains or in a sector with lower productivity gains. And this model has several properties. Some are efficient, some are not, but it had clear effect on the structure of wages in Europe. Now, for the EU, it's important to increase the dispersion of wages to align wages on the productivity of the individual in his region according to his company. So there's actually this commitment of the EU to increase inequalities, not to reduce them. And also my next point is that what's funny about this strategy is that the only actors which are supposed to do something are states, right? Only states, not unions, not even firms. So you have a very administrative process where states are being asked to do structural reforms. And they are apparently very committed to them, because if you look at the conclusions of last week's summit, you'll read that it says that all member states of the euro area are fully determined to continue their policy of fiscal consolidation and structural reforms. When you read the following paragraphs, you'll see that the heads of states and governments welcome the important steps taken by Spain to increase the flexibility of its labor market. They're also very happy with Italy's plans to further liberalize local public services and utilities. And if you needed, if you needed a clearer message, the document says further on that as regards the functioning of the European Stability Fund, the financial help that could be granted to countries in need in the future, strict conditionality will apply in line with IMF practices. So what I'm thinking more and more is that the EU is sort of thinking itself as a developing country, right? As a developing zone. So that's that's the reason why I made the parallel with Argentina, right? We don't master our own money just in some way as Argentina with respect to the dollar. We as Europeans, we sort of accept globalization as it is, right? We don't change the rules of the game. And there was this wave of optimism around year 2000 when the aim of the EU was sort of to catch up with the US, right? European leaders was fascinated with the success of the US, and the idea was, we had to be as high-tech as the US to become, a competitive, knowledge-based economy. Now, what I'm thinking more and more is that we're sort of in a Galbraithian moment, father and son, if you wish, because it just happens that it's been a short, great book published in French about John Kenneth Galbraith, and I was reading it on the plane, and it just struck me that everything is there. Right? The question is development, not growth. The question is poverty, not just fighting unemployment. The question is conventional wisdom, right? Conventional wisdom which reigns in Europe and says that austerity is good, that debt is bad, that competition is good, that unions are bad, etc., etc. And what's striking in the current situation, if we, on top of everything that has been said before, is that both markets and citizens need a project, right? Need a vision of the future, right? I'm not saying it's the main one, but one of the reasons the markets are so hard with public debt in Europe is that they don't know where we're going. And of course they don't, because nobody does. So I think that what Europe needs today is really to take again the question of development. Which kind of economy do we want in 20 years from now? What do we produce? How do we organize our societies, our territories? Bruno has insisted on the fact that, for instance, the stress of the Lisbon strategy on knowledge-based technologies can only lead to further concentration of power of individuals among the cities, among the best European universities, while for social and ecological reasons, you would need a much more diffusion of development on the territory. So, my conclusion is that Europe should really think about itself seriously as a developing continent and again tackling the question of development. Thank you.
Thank you. It is exactly 12. One question, two questions? Do we want to, how much? Why don't we'll take two questions because that's all that keeps us between here and lunch. So make them very, very good. Jamie, I saw.
I thought the conversation flowed very smoothly from Vlasbeck and Gutman through Toporowski to Ravo. And I wanted to say something that sort of tied together this discussion. There was a framing of the argument at the beginning as essentially a struggle between capital and labor. And when I was a graduate student at Cambridge, we were taught to question what is capital. But it seems to me that the appropriate question now is what exactly is labor in this context. One of the aspects of globalization is that the production of tradable goods is moving out of the advanced regions, and the number of people who are engaged in that activity in the advanced regions is relatively small, with productivity gains and with trade. And yet the number of people who are involved in providing services that maintain the quality of life, education, healthcare, public services, the whole raft of, and also non-traded services in the market is much larger, and these people have much less leverage than workers traditionally have in extracting rents from the enterprises that they actually work for. They have to be working through a political system which becomes very vulnerable. And it seems to me that we ought to be perhaps be thinking in terms of a kind of quality taxation trap. That the status of being a developed and advanced society depends upon having these services function effectively, but as they are squeezed, their quality declines, and as that happens, so does the willingness to pony up the tax revenues required to maintain them. And so you are facing not just something which is a matter of the competitiveness of particular regions, but the matter of the ability to maintain an advanced society's structures of a high quality of life overall.
Why don't we get one more question, and you can respond to that end of the question.
Thank you. First, I would embrace my distinguished colleague for having dared to raise the question of class warfare. It's obvious that now the core European governments and especially the French, because the French government is some kind of a caricature, are just the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, to quote the well-known phrase of Karl Marx. It is why we are indeed in long-run structural crisis. I entirely agree with you. And I think that the so-called debt crisis and bond crisis is just some kind of consequence of twin structural crises. The first is obviously a deep change in European capitalism. The fact that European capitalism is more and more flying from the real economy. They are no more interested into the real economy. They are interested into finance and investing abroad. when you look at the balance sheet of the largest French corporations, 60% on the average of their assets are financial assets. One of the reasons why banks, French banks especially, jumped over bonds, the so-called sovereign bonds, was the fact that the French private sector is no more intending to borrow for productive expenditures. So I do think that European capitalism is now a parasite rentier system, and that we should think, thanks to Yannis' work, to some kind of social capitalism relying on Keynes, Kalecki, Steindl, and their likes. But there is a second structural crisis, the total bankruptcy of the European elite. I am absolutely frightened by the obsession of the structural reforms. And what are structural reforms? Counter-revolutionary agenda, worse than what Hayek and Ayn Rand had in mind. It is a shame. And we must never forget that who spoke for the first time of the necessity of structural reforms, flexible market, privatization of most of the state activities. Jacques Delors, as Minister of Finance, when he launched the plan of deflation in 1983. It was the first time that a government openly declared that full employment was no more on the agenda and that a strong rise in unemployment was required. At that time, I had worked for some time with the Socialist Party and I left. I remember a debate when the so-called Programme Commun was decreed, a secret meeting of the highest level of the future regime of François Mitterrand. Jacques Attali and Delors were asked by whom? American bankers. But what about your commitment to cut spending? And Delors and Attali said, as soon as we could, we will cut. Thank you.
So if we could have very quick responses to both comments, because
I would like to briefly answer to what Jamie has been saying. I think, nevertheless, we can complain about everything under the sun. But that doesn't help us. It doesn't get us a step forward. What we have to understand and what we have to make clear, and when I say we, I talk about Keynesians or people who are working in that tradition, we have to make clear that the labor market is not working like a normal market. That's the core of the thing that I wanted to, that's my message that I wanted to convey. And insofar, your question is right. What is labor? Yeah, labor does not exist in the traditional forms anymore. Maybe it does not exist. In Germany it does, but in other countries it does not. But then we need the government to step in and to produce, so to say, a functional equivalent that produces the kind of incentive for, or the guidance for companies to increase wages in line with at least the productivity increase. If we don't do that, then the system will not work. You see, in the United States, you're stuck now. The wages are not rising because unemployment is high, but unemployment doesn't go down because wages remain low. So if you're there, then it's over. There is no, if you don't have political instruments, and you don't have them anymore, to either go for a huge fiscal push or for a strong monetary expansion, which is anyway out of the cards, and fiscal pushes out of political cards. So then you're stuck. Then you will go into Japanese deflation, stagnation for 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, I don't know. But I can predict that the political system will not survive under these conditions. And that is why we have to fundamentally rethink the labor market. Let me just give one anecdote. When the Schröder government came out with its famous Agenda 2010, when it flexibilized the labor market, it all went under the rubrum of flexibilizing the labor market. They sent around to all the party members of the Social Democratic Party in Germany a letter saying, we are Social Democrats, but nevertheless, we have to admit the labor market is a market. And if it is a market, wages have to come down. And this is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I would just. I agree with what was said. In fact, I'm in the embarrassing situation that everything that I wanted to say has been said by someone else, even better than I could possibly say it. I would just add one point about the social model. The post-war social model was very much based on an alliance between the poor people who'd done the poor and the middle classes. The middle classes haven't been made insecure by what happened in the interwar period. The model that emerged in the 70s recreated the middle classes around asset inflation, particularly residential housing, where the middle classes found a new welfare state, and that was the housing market. You could borrow against that, and this for me is the material basis of Thatcherism or Reaganism or whatever. The disengagement of the middle classes from the state welfare state for which they pay taxes. And let's remember that the majority of the taxes are paid by the middle classes. They're paying the taxes, but they're now disengaged from the official welfare state. So you have this strategy of salami slicing the welfare state and the increasing oppression of the poor, breaking down of trade unions, and so on. Let me just add one point which I didn't mention about repaying national debts. There's actually only one system of repaying national debts that would work effectively, and that was the system that David Ricardo put forward, and that is that if you repay the national debt with a tax on capital, if you taxed wealth, and particularly if you taxed financial wealth, this is probably the only condition under which you could generate a sufficient surplus to be able to repay the government debt without actually causing the economy to move into recession, because such a tax would have very little impact on expenditure in the economy, but it would of course be very highly resisted, in particular by the banks.
I want to be brief, even though this is a profound question that Jamie raised. I would think that structural crises are always also crises of the identity of capitalism, and it's a bit like a human being going through different phases. But the current one clearly is a crisis of the West, in the sense that it's a crisis of post-industrial societies that are becoming essentially service economies more and more. We will certainly in the afternoon and tomorrow morning try to provide a vision, but this is the political project we're facing ultimately, right? It's to find, the left has to find a certain vision of a capitalist system that is better than the one that has fallen apart. And there I would just, before we get into like energy and so forth, I think there's also, especially when I'm in Europe and walking around in Vienna, I see that also a huge demographic issue. There's two groups, the elderly and the young, that are sort of on the margin of this crisis. And so this raises the question of healthcare and education in the most profound way.
Yeah, I would have just one word to say that in the current context, I think there are gains in fiscal reform which could sort of try to begin to answer your question in terms of restoring a balanced budget, while developing public services, while reducing inequalities, taxing financial capital. The other thing I would like to insist on is that among the many problems we have in Europe in our conversation is that everybody is thinking in terms of countries. And as Heiner has stressed, this is the first and the biggest mistake we're all making. And even in passing, it's hard not to say, you know, the Germans want this or Germany does that, and etc. While, as we've said this morning, it's the classic conflict between, of course, the haves and the have-nots, and it's really difficult when you are in a multinational setting to avoid those cliches about nations against nations. And we know it's not a new problem, but we have to be very cautious about that.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel for a terrific set of presentations. We'll now have lunch upstairs, and then we will reconvene here at 2 o'clock for the next panel. Thank you.